since we spoke with our next guest, where he spoke about the new apostolic reformation. And he's come back via Zoom to speak with us again today. Matthew D. Taylor is a religious studies scholar and expert in independent charismatic Christianity and Christian nationalism. He is also the creator, writer, and narrator of the Charismatic Revival Fury audio documentary series on the Straight White American Jesus podcast. And if you haven't listened to the Straight White American Jesus podcast, seriously, what are you even doing with your lives? You should all download it right now, subscribe to it. It is very good, and he does some really great deep dives about Christianity and specifically evangelical Christianity. So let's go ahead and welcome Matthew Taylor, everybody. And do we want him to be full screen, y'all? Okay, then let's go ahead and do that. And then I'm just going to take this so when we have questions, I'll be able to run around like Phil Donahue. Okay.
And just to be clear, I have 30 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great.
Yes.
All right, let me share my screen because I do have a slideshow here for us. And I guess it's morning where you are, afternoon where I am. So good morning to you. Thank you for having me with you today. And I'm just grateful for the invitation and grateful that gatherings like this can take place. I think it's very productive to get together and think together. So as I'm presenting, I want to talk a little bit about my book, but I also just want to think about the moment that we are in. And I'd like to offer 3 theses for the moment that we're in, for the election that we just came through, and for what we can do going forward. So I'm going to run through these really quickly, and I'll go through them in much more depth as I go along. The first is that MAGA is a populist authoritarian movement wedded to a religious nationalist movement. And it's important that we get our categories straight about what we're dealing with and what is going on in our country right now. The second thesis is that the Christian theologies and Christian supremacist identities that have come to the fore in the Trump MAGA era are a kind of threat the US has not seen before. We're dealing with something new. And then the third thesis is that if we are going to resist and or defeat MAGA, which I think we need the biggest possible secular and religious coalition available. So let me go through those in a little bit more depth, and I want to talk about January 6th along the way, because I think it's a very important piece of what is going on right now. So first, again, that first thesis, MAGA is a populist authoritarian movement wedded to a religious nationalist movement. And by populist authoritarian movement, we are talking about movements that are in many ways the Achilles heel of democracies, of liberal democracies. Populist authoritarian movements use these kind of primal tribal fears and promises of empowering their own tribe to bring an authoritarian government to power via democratic elections. And this is the real challenge. This is what the founding fathers called the demagogue, right? This is a movement that utilizes the emotions and the fears that people carry, gets them into this kind of tribal polarized space, comes to power, and then institutes their own authoritarian agenda. And we've seen this around the world. There are many of these populist authoritarian movements. This is a surging phenomenon around the world. We see this in Viktor Orban's Hungary. We see this in Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey. We see this in Narendra Modi's India. So this is not unique to the United States, but this is what we are dealing with in the United States now. So when we talk about a religious nationalist movement, though, I think it's important that we, again, define our terms. And so what are we talking about when we're talking about American Christian nationalism? So as I said, this is part of a species that we could call religious nationalism, right? The idea that you can conflate your national identity, your political clan, your sense of patriotism with your religion, that those layers merge very neatly. That is the idea of religious nationalism. I think it is well captured in these flags that we saw everywhere on January 6th, that Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, as though those two thoughts were somehow inseparable for some people. Right. And right now we're in a moment where globally religious nationalism is on the rise. As I was saying, that you can see instances of this in Turkey. You can see Jewish nationalism on the rise, what we would call religious Zionism in Israel. You can see Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar and Sri Lanka, Christian nationalism in Russia and Hungary and Brazil, Hindu nationalism in India. This is a global phenomenon, and the U.S. is very much following a global trend in this at the moment. I think we should be very much in conversation with what is going on around the world. This is not a sui generis American exceptionalism kind of situation that we're in. We are part of a global culture and a global moment, and I think we need to attend to that. Now, when we talk about this in the U.S., this is seen in this assertion that the U.S. is a Christian nation, so that America, in one definition, America has a special ordained covenantal relationship with God. Or another version of this is that Christians and or Christianity should be privileged over other religious and non-religious identities in government policy and the public square. The first definition is a little bit more philosophical, a little more theological, a little more about the kind of identity of the United States. The second one is much more about policy. And these often go together, but they can be teased out. And so I think we need to always be clear who we're talking about and what form of Christian nationalism we're talking about. And I think it's also, we need to attend to some of the shifts that have gone on in our culture really within the last 4 decades or so that have brought about this. And so I want to offer two statements, one of which should probably be uncontroversial to everyone in the room. The second of which is actually very controversial in our society right now, but I think they're both actually very true. So the first is the decline of white dominance in the United States has produced a white nationalist and white supremacist backlash. Hopefully that's not controversial to anyone in the room, right? And so you have the chart here showing the census data, and as you can see, in 1990, more than 3/4 of the U.S. population identified as white, and by 2020 that was down under 58%. Right. So, and of course, in August of 2017, we witnessed some of the backlash of that in this Unite the Right rally that occurred in Charlottesville, where you had white nationalists and white supremacist protesters marching in the streets. And what are they chanting? You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. Right. And anti-Semitism is always this kind of ground layer. As conspiracy theories and paranoia emerge, anti-Semitism is always there. It's always going to come out in those moments. Now, here's the more controversial statement. The decline of Christian dominance in the United States has produced a Christian nationalist and Christian supremacist backlash. So here again, we see a chart showing from in 1990, up until 1990, in all the survey data that we have, 90% or more of Americans identified as Christian. Right? So to say the United States is a Christian nation in 1970 means something very different than it means today when somebody asserts that. Down now today in 2020 and 2022, they're measuring this at around 63% of Americans are identifying as Christian. So in the course of about 35 years, roughly a third of the people who were identifying as Christian, or at least of the percentage of the population that was identifying as Christian, has melted away. And we are a more secular nation today than we were even a few decades ago. Now, these two things go together. Right? But not all perfectly. It's not always white Christians. In fact, part of what we saw in this most recent election is that Christians of color were migrating towards Donald Trump. And I think we need to attend to that. Now, when we talk about Christian nationalism, I think we need to both attend to the international situation. We also need to recognize that Christian nationalism is a spectrum, and not all forms of Christian nationalism are as much of a threat as others. So I think we need to think about this spectrum and pay attention to, again, who are we engaging with? What are the forms of Christian nationalism that we are encountering in the real world? And I would argue that the spectrum runs from what we could call soft Christian nationalism, and there's other terms for this that have been used in the different surveys and books that have been written. This is my terminology, but this is a more kind of passive, more democratic, more sentimental style of Christian nationalism. And I see this symbolized in, and this is very common in many churches, having an American flag alongside a Christian flag at the church altar. Right? That's not, in churches I grew up going to, that was a common practice. It's not my cup of tea. I would prefer not to have a national symbol in my church, but it's also not a huge threat to American democracy. I sometimes also call these soft Christian nationalists the God bless America kind of Christian nationalists, right? It's a nostalgic kind of sentimental thing. They like the idea of a simpler, more Christian country. Now, at the other end of the spectrum are very dangerous forms of Christian nationalism, what we would call hardline Christian nationalisms, also known as Christian supremacy. And this is more organized, more anti-democratic, and more theological. Ironically, the more theology people introduce into their Christian nationalism, the more hardline it becomes, because it becomes built into their belief system. If it's just nostalgia, if it's just kind of a vague sense of godly patriotism, then it's not going to interfere as much with their religious identity. The more theological it becomes, the more dangerous, I would argue, that Christian nationalism becomes. And when we talk about radicalization in the United States Christian population, it's about people moving along this spectrum, people moving from these more passive, sentimental forms of Christian nationalism into more hardline forms of Christian nationalism and Christian supremacy. And right now, the situation that we are in, and this is very much the context in which the 2024 election occurred, the lost cause narrative that Donald Trump and his allies advanced about the 2020 election, the idea that the 2020 election was stolen from them, has spurred along many conspiracy theories, has radicalized many Christian nationalists, and is encouraging more and more of this violent and anti-democratic rhetoric and organizing. Here's a crazy statistic. Coming into the 2024 election, 1/3 of the US population believed that the 2020 election was stolen. 1/3. And if you looked among white evangelicals, it was closer to 2/3. So we're talking about a set of beliefs in conspiracy theories that are distorting reality for 1/3 of the population coming into this election. And then what we witnessed 4 years ago on January 6th was a coalition of these white nationalists and white supremacists and Christian nationalists and Christian supremacists making an anti-democratic power grab to reinstall their avatar, Donald Trump, as an illegitimate president. That was what January 6th was about. You can get into all the details about, oh, there were fights over the Electoral College and the counting of the electoral votes and all the technicalities of that and Dominion voting and what specific conspiracies. But in the big picture, that is what was going on 4 years ago on January 6th. And what we just witnessed a few months ago was they didn't need an insurrection to do it. They were able to do it through an election. And that is the danger of these populist authoritarian movements. So, our second thesis, Christian theologies and Christian supremacist identities that have come to the fore in the Trump MAGA era are a kind of threat the US has not seen before. I want to dig into this a little bit because I think this is really where the argument of my book in many ways. The ascendant style of American Christian nationalism is what we would call independent and charismatic. And let me define both those terms. So charismatic here, we're not using this in the kind of generic sense of somebody who has a magnetic and attractive personality. Here we're using it in the technical Christian sense. And this comes from the Greek. It's a term that is used in the Christian New Testament. And the idea of the charismata, or the gifts or the graces of God, these are special endowments through the Holy Spirit that are given to the church for the service of the church. And so to be charismatic today is to be a Christian who is invested in accessing these more supernatural dimensions of early Christianity. This includes things like speaking in tongues, belief in miracles and modern miracles and performing miracles, belief in modern day prophecy. And then when we talk about independent, that's a synonym for non-denominational, as in not attached to the bureaucracy and accountability and governance of denominational bodies. Now, how do you know if you are encountering an independent charismatic person or an independent charismatic church? Well, there's some markers of this, and you actually have quite a few of these in Arizona, and I know I've spoken with some of you before about some of the specific independent charismatic churches that are operating in your particular region. But this independent charismatic part of the church is the fastest growing segment in American Christianity and the fastest growing segment in global Christianity. So this is a growth edge in the church. This is a very rapidly growing part of the church, both in the US and globally. It's also ethnically diverse and globally connected. This is not just a US phenomenon. This is something that is happening all around the world and is highly networked around the world. And so leaders from the US in these movements are also traveling around the world, and leaders from around the world are coming to the US, and there's theological ideas that are crossing borders and crossing boundaries. So this is not merely an issue of, oh, this is an American problem, this is an American situation. This is something that's happening globally. In fact, 2 years ago, there were the Capitol riots that occurred in Brasilia, in Brazil, over the ouster of Jair Bolsonaro. Many of the same networks of Christian leaders that were involved in the US Capitol riot were also involved in organizing and mobilizing for the Brasilia Capitol riots. So this is not merely a thing that is happening in the US. There are transnational networks of Christian supremacy that have their targets set on the United States right now. One of the things that is very common in this independent charismatic space is a belief in what they would call modern prophecy, that there are prophets living amongst us right now who speak the words of God. This is unusual in the history of the church. This is a fairly new belief that people are adopting, that there are modern day prophets. And they also will engage in these ecstatic spiritual practices, like being slain in the spirit, having an almost fainting fit, a spiritual fainting fit, fainting fit. And there's also an emphasis in this world on what they call spiritual warfare, the idea that there are angels and demons battling around us all the time, and that Christians can participate in this invisible cosmic warfare through prayer practices, through blowing shofars, through participating in worship services, right? So this is a very militant conception of the life of the church and of the role of the church in society. And as I said, because they're independent, they are not tied into any of these denominational accountability structures, but they are highly networked, especially at the leadership level. There's this global leadership and celebrity class of charismatic celebrities who operate in charismatic media, who are very, very relationally interconnected. And you can't actually understand this world without recognizing the relationships among these leaders and how those function. And I sometimes refer to this whole sector of American Christianity as the Silicon Valley of the American church. It's ecstatic, it's experiential, and it's very technologically savvy, very good at breaking into new technological spaces, very active on social media, very active on YouTube. They have podcasts. I mean, there's a whole media culture that exists around this kind of independent charismatic space that actually is one of the main vectors for carrying these conspiracy theories. It's not just Fox News. It's not just OANN. It's especially these Christian networks that are carrying some of these conspiracy theories. And that's why we see higher levels of belief in lies about the 2020 election among Christians than among other groups. So in my book, I argue that at the heart of January 6th, there was a band of these independent charismatic thought leaders centered around this man, C. Peter Wagner. And even though Peter Wagner died in 2016, I argue that he and the people that he mentored had a very significant impact on January 6th. And Peter Wagner was a Fuller Seminary professor. I myself am an alumni of Fuller Seminary, fairly mainstream evangelical seminary. But towards the end of his life, Peter Wagner went in many ways around the bend, and he became fixated with these charismatic leaders and with these independent charismatic spaces, and he began to pioneer new modes of spiritual warfare in the 1990s that he called strategic spiritual warfare, that he argued was you were able to battle back demonic hierarchies. There were high-level, high-ranking demons that had control over literal physical territory, and if you could just mobilize enough Christians praying and doing spiritual warfare at the same time, you could cast out these high-level demons. And he also came to believe in the 1990s in the idea of a modern-day apostles and modern-day prophets who would lead the church into a global revival and establish Christian dominion over societies. And he pulled together a bunch of these leaders and a bunch of these ideas, and he branded that as the New Apostolic Reformation. This was the phrase that he kind of glommed onto as the marker of his movement. He started building out these leadership networks of these people who were claiming to be apostles and prophets. Many of them were also pastors of local churches, but they were adopting these identities of we are modern day apostles, we are modern day prophets. And at the peak of the New Apostolic Reformation movement, there were hundreds, maybe even in the low thousands of leaders who were participating in Wagner's networks, who were identifying with this movement. And those leaders, those networks of leaders became the backbone of Christian Trumpism as Donald Trump entered American politics. And so, and I tell the whole backstory of this in my book, but the long and short of it is that the New Apostolic Reformation and these other independent charismatic leaders were some of the first and most ardent Christians to support Donald Trump in the 2016 election. A very important figure here is a guy named Lance Wallnau, who was a friend and an acolyte, a mentee of Peter Wagner's. Also very central in this dynamic is Paula White Cain, who is Trump's closest spiritual advisor and the chair of his Evangelical Advisory Board, currently called the National Faith Advisory Board. And Paula White Cain really was the linchpin who opened the doors of the Trump campaign to these independent charismatic leaders, got them in at the ground level, and then really brought them into the center of power. And at least a dozen of Trump's evangelical advisors were or are apostles and prophets affiliated with the networks that Wagner started, and many more were independent charismatic megachurch pastors. Some of these were formal advisors. Sometimes it was more informal. And so sometimes you can look at the lists. You also have to watch the pictures and who's showing up, who's around Trump, who's having meetings with him. There's actually a fairly wide circle of people of religious leaders who surround Donald Trump, who propagandize him, and who vouch for him to their communities and to the broader Christian community. Now, as I said, one of the markers of this independent charismatic belief is the belief in modern day prophecy. And so part of what happens starting in 2015, almost as soon as Donald Trump enters the race, there begins to be prophecies issued by these charismatic prophets about Donald Trump, saying that he's a figure of special destiny, that he is God's chosen person to lead the country, that he is the one who is destined to become president. And when Donald Trump wins the 2016 election, this only accelerates this process of these prophecies around Donald Trump. And by the time of the 2020 election, hundreds of these charismatic prophets claimed that they had divine revelation, that to each of them individually, that God was going to anoint Donald Trump for a second term in office, that God had chosen Donald Trump for a second term in office. And so once Donald Trump refused to accept the results of the 2020 election, all these prophets start saying in chorus, God needs to intervene. We need to do spiritual warfare to fulfill these prophecies. And this became the spirituality of January 6th, building towards spiritual warfare campaigns to fulfill these prophecies about Donald Trump. And the leaders from the New Apostolic Reformation were central to organizing and orchestrating these campaigns of spiritual warfare, guided around trying to get Donald Trump reinstated. They were supplying in many ways the spiritual complement to the Stop the Steal rally. And that's why you have a number of these New Apostolic Reformation leaders, and I describe many of the key ones in my book, who then show up on January 6th. They both create the ideas, the theological ideas that undergird January 6th, and then they show up themselves and are leading the people in the crowd. Now, I'd love to get into this, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions if you have questions. But check out my book, or if you can't afford the $30 or whatever for the book, go and listen to the podcast. But I want to highlight what is unique about this moment in American Christian supremacist organizing and power. And just 3 points here. First, Christian supremacists have access to the White House and sway over their president and party like they've never had before. Donald Trump is more responsive to these leaders than George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush or Ronald Reagan ever were. He sees them as his core constituency. He gives them a great deal of access to himself, and especially through people like Paula White Cain. They have a lot of sway in the White House and in the agenda setting. And that's new. A lot of times the Republican presidents in the past played along with these folks, welcomed their support, but then Heisman trophied them when the time came to actually make policy. That's not the case, especially not in the second Trump administration. Second, these Christian supremacists have a highly networked and grassroots infrastructure, which has, as far as I can tell, there's no parallel to this on the left. There is no deep bench of grassroots networks that are all linked together, that are all coordinating, that are all spreading messages, that are all mobilizing and getting out the vote. And part of the genius of the 2024 Trump campaign was deploying these networks of Christian leaders and Christian mobilization as their grassroots mobilization. It was a very, very effective get out the vote strategy, and it worked quite well. And lastly, these Christian supremacists have endowed Trump and MAGA with this prophecy-driven national revival sense of destiny. There's a great deal of optimism in these circles that they are going to accomplish their agenda. And so I think we need to be attentive that this is not merely like, oh, humdrum, they're kind of business as usual. They see this as a moment to push really hard because they recognize that they have a window of opportunity in the second Trump administration to get through a lot of things they've been wanting for decades. And so lastly, and here's the last thesis, is if we are going to resist and or defeat MAGA, we need the biggest possible secular and religious coalition that we can muster. Let me offer just a quick reflection on how I think Americans are divided right now, and I'll end with this, and hopefully, again, we have a couple minutes for questions. I think we exist as a society right now in three bubbles that are roughly a third of the country each. The first third of the country that I've already mentioned is the MAGA bundle. And this is, they live in this propaganda bubble where they believe in these conspiracy theories. This is mostly rural and ex-urban, some suburban. I live in a suburban neighborhood. There's Trump banners all over my neighborhood. They're predominantly Christian. They're predominantly white, but as we saw in this recent election, it was not only white people that gravitated towards Trump. There was a broad spectrum of Christians actually moved to Trump's direction. They buy into these conspiracy theories about the 2020 election. And I would argue that the folks in this MAGA core, not everyone who voted for Trump, but folks in this MAGA core are virtually unreachable and undetachable from Trump. They are committed to this stuff to the point where they believe the lies, right? They buy into the conspiracy theories. You're not going to dislodge that easily for these folks. Now, the bubble at the other end of the spectrum is the one that I'm assuming most of us on this call or in this room are in, and that's what I would call the liberal mainstream media bubble, right? So this is folks who typically are urban and suburban. These are the folks who live in the blue dots. If you see the political maps, these are liberal Christians, people who are secular, people who belong to other religions predominantly. They're college educated and they're financially stable. They live in factual reality, but we also have a narrow cultural consensus. Just to illustrate it, I thought it was incredibly simple to look at this election and say Kamala Harris is the person that should be chosen in this election. She seems perfectly qualified. She seems like a wonderful person. She seems smart. She's got the experience. Why wouldn't anyone choose her over Trump? And yet the country did not, right? So the consensus that obtains within that little liberal bubble, as much as it may be grounded in reality and in commentary and in smart ideas, does not work for everyone. It did not reach the country. And there we come to the third bubble, the bubble in the middle. This is what I would just call the disaffected bubble. People in this are all over the map. Urban, suburban, ex-urban, rural. They're all over the place. Many of them are nominal Christians, right? They're not, these are kind of, I call these people the shruggers when it comes to religion. They're what we might call the nuns oftentimes, the people who say when they're asked what their religious identity is, none of the above. But these are people who religion, as far as I can tell, is not a very big deal to them. But they might have some kind of vestigial attachment to some religious identity. They're very downtrodden. They're very angry with American politics and with American institutions, and they do not consume mainstream media. They have a very chaotic media and information diet. And part of what this election revealed is that the people in the middle, that third in the middle, is far more susceptible to Trump propaganda and MAGA and right-wing messaging than they are to the mainstream media and to, honestly, reality. Here is the task for the next 4 years. The whole ball game is in who wins the middle. And if I can say anything to a gathering titled the Secular Summit in early January 2025, it is this. Secularists and Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and every other religious or non-religious group that values liberal democracy needs to band together right now. Elections are not going to get any easier from here. Part of the populist authoritarian playbook is you pull up the ladder behind you and you make the elections harder from that point forward, and you enshrine your group in a privileged position in society. Elections are only going to get harder from here. And so we need to build a supermajority coalition to win over as much of that middle as possible. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know what that middle needs or what they want. And I think part of the task of the next 4 years is we have to go out relationally and in every other way, institutionally, and figure out what the people in the middle need and build the biggest possible coalition that we can. And that coalition is going to have to be part secular and part religious. That's just the demographics of it. And so my secular friends, value and welcome your religious friends. Part of the vocabulary we need right now for resistance is theological. And I say the same thing to Christian groups. Value your secular friends. We need our secular friends in this mix. That is the coalition that we need to put together. I'm going to stop talking and hopefully we have a minute for some questions. But again, thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much. All right, there's quite a few questions that I have coming in. If you want to stop sharing your screen, Matthew. Let's see, I've got some questions coming in from our Zoom. So Matthew, first question is, who is funding these fundy Christian networks?
It's a good question. A lot of it's coming from the grassroots, but there are larger donor groups. There was some great reporting that I helped with through ProPublica this last year on a particular donor group called Ziklag, Z-I-K-L-A-G, that's very much tied to these NAR paradigms and some of these NAR leaders. And I think the gateway to get into Ziklag, it's a donor group. I think you had to have like $10 or $25 million net worth just to be part of the group. So there are some very big pocketed or donors and organizations that are behind this. I mean, the Christian right is extremely well networked and extremely well funded in our country. And again, there's no parallel for this on the left. And so we're going to stand up resistance to this. I think there's going to need to be a lot of funding for it. But I also think sometimes the funding can be a red herring because the funding is functional. I think we need to pay attention to the theology and the agenda far more than the funding, because it's not. I don't know that the funding is even accessible to be prevented.
Okay. Next, we have another question coming in from Zoom. Did the rise and success of U.S. Taliban form blue? Okay, did the rise success of U.S. Taliban?
ISIS.
Oh, it's a typo. Okay, thank you. So
ISIS.
did the rise of ISIS and Taliban form a blueprint for the Christian nationalist movement?
Not consciously. I mean, they would definitely not ever claim that they received any inspiration for ISIS. Here's the reality. Both of these movements are very diffuse. And that's just the nature of things right now. Networks work far better in this diffuse postmodern landscape than hierarchical institutions. And so these kind of resistance or nationalist organizations that organize around networks do a lot better. There's an excellent book called The Rise of Network Christianity, if you want to understand the backdrop for sociologically why these networks are functioning so well. But that's what's going on. That's why you see these resemblances there. It's not that they're taking inspiration from each other. They're both converging on the best possible leadership structure to meet this moment.
Okay, thank you. Another question coming in from Zoom. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, I can come out there, Phil Donahue style. Is Charlie Kirk a cog in the New Apostolic Reformation?
He's very much an ally of the New Apostolic Reformation. He has espoused a lot of their ideology, has adopted their Seven Mountain Mandate framework as the organizing structure for Turning Point USA. I wouldn't call him a cog, though. I would say that he's an activist in their vein, and they see him as an ally. They work very closely with him. He's had mentors from the New Apostolic Reformation movement. They would see him as an ally and leader. He's not a tool of theirs. He has agency of his own, but he is very much working in like-minded purposes with them.
Okay. How about live? We have one question. I'm going to walk down so that you can ask Matthew directly.
Thanks for what you've presented. I look at history in America, look at Civil War. We've rewritten that history. because we now want to look at it as an economical war, not a slavery war. So that would be the historical shift that the right wing wants to do. The Depression was also anti-Jewish. So there was a lot of movement before World War II for a lot of Christians to rise up against Jews. And you had a lot of mainstream Catholics would be one that bought into that system. So when I look at today's situation, I look at it as an evolution. Which Christianity will win out? So what kind of Christian will emerge in this current stew? You mentioned the Pentecostal type, but really what is it? Because it's a change, it's a softened Jesus approach and more of a Paul maybe approach, because we're looking at 2 Timothy, when we're looking at kowtowing to the empire. So changing of American thinking of Christianity is a American Christian theology and a political theology that's not found in the Bible as much as it's found in the pulpit, because they've changed the thinking. So I don't know. I've presented you some different ideas, but I sit here as an ex-Catholic priest who is involved in a progressive Christian church, which I believe we're under attack. I'm gay. I'm under attack. I'm white. Oh, I'm under attack. But the whole idea is, I think what we've done is, and what we've done so masterfully, we've bypassed the oligarchs that are running things right now, and we've put in Christian oligarchs into this system, and again, it's anti-Jesus, it's anti-biblical teaching, it's anti-prophetic Jew, because there's nothing in the Pentecostal prophetic word that is really speaking to the empire. Didn't they want to cast down the empires who were going to the golden calf? There's a whole bunch of stuff going on.
Yeah, no, great series of questions. I'll just pick a couple of them. So I have no idea which version of Christianity is going to win out. That's a very hard thing to predict. I will say that this is the part of Christianity that's growing right now, right? And so I think those of us who identify as Christians, and I do identify as a Christian, who want to resist this, I think we need to articulate a different theological vision. In fact, my next book that I'm working on is going to be a theology book attempting to refute Christian supremacy and Christian nationalism using the fundamental principles of the Christian tradition and Christian doctrine. And I think more of us need to be doing that. We need to be constructing alternative theologies that resist and challenge this. And that doesn't mean that those theologies are going to win out or become extremely popular. Historically, it's much more popular in Christianity to beat up on people than to be Jesus-like, right? And so, but that doesn't mean that those of us who identify as Christian can then give up on being Jesus-like. It means that we need to push harder. We need to present our theology more compellingly, and we need to make that argument. And those of us who identify as Christians, I think we have a special obligation to resist this, because it's being done in our name, and it's being done in the name of Jesus. And to me, that is verging on heresy at the very least. Thank you.
Thank you. This will have to be our last question. If you want to go ahead and ask the question.
Okay, so my question
Is
is,
it on?
is it on?
Test.
I can hear you fine.
Okay.
Test.
I can repeat that. Go ahead and what's your question?
So my question, it's kind of two parts. One is with this professor from Fuller who created kind of this network. Can you name who are some of these groups in this network? And the second part infighting starts. Is there infighting going on, or you pointed out how they're standing around Trump? Is there some infighting going on?
Okay, so the question was, who are some of these groups that are involved in this deep network of Christian nationalists? And the second part of your question was, is there infighting within those groups?
Yeah, so in terms of the networks themselves, when we're talking about the independent charismatic world, it really is the leadership culture across the board in the independent charismatic world. And that includes what's called the Word of Faith movement, which is often termed the prosperity gospel, the New Apostolic Reformation, and some of these other apostolic and prophetic networks that I get into in my book. That also includes Messianic Judaism, which is very much an independent charismatic movement. And so those folks really do work well together. I mean, there are internal rivalries, but on the surface, they all are friends and chummy and claim to work together. There are rivalries between different forms of Christian nationalism in the United States. I would say that there's three really prominent forms of Christian supremacy right now in the US. One is what we would call radical traditionalist Catholics. That's the J.D. Vance camp. And that's kind of a masculine manosphere kind of space. There's the Reformed Reconstructionists, often just called the kind of Calvinist Theobros group. And that's the Pete Hegseth kind of coalition, centered around especially Doug Wilson in Idaho. And then there's these independent charismatic networks. And all of those are jockeying for position, and they all have slightly different agendas that they're trying to push through in the Trump administration. But they all also can get together on being anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ, pro-teaching of Christianity in public schools. So they've got a lot of runway where they're all together. We go down pretty far down the road, and you'll see some real divisions emerge. Right now, Trump is holding them all together just because they all like him.
Okay. All right, well, our next guest is waiting, so if you all could join me in a nice round of applause for Matthew Taylor. Thank you so much, Matthew. We appreciate you.
Thank you all.
And I hope that our paths cross again soon. So